In this lesson on human reproduction, we're going to have a look at some of the changes that occur in the baby at birth. Now, these changes in particular are going to be looking at the fetal circulation. So, in order for us to see the changes, it's important we understand what are some of the requirements of the fetus at birth. So, in terms of fetal requirements, we've looked at these previously with the placenta, but three of the key ones are the fetus requires nutrition, it requires respiratory assistance, and it also requires waste removal into things like immunity and hormonal control. Now, the exchange of all of these materials occurs thanks to the placenta. But there are two really important observations we need to make. Number one, it's during this time that the lungs are not needed. They're not needed because the mother is providing all of the oxygen and removing all of the carbon dioxide for the developing fetus via the placenta. Secondly, as the fetus itself is not eating, it is not having to process its own food, the mother is doing that, and as a consequence, the liver is not required to detoxify any of the chemicals found in the food. Therefore, in the fetal circulation, it becomes possible for the fetus to allow the lungs and the liver to be bypassed, and this can occur thanks to three particular structures, which we'll look at now. They are, number one, the foramen ovale, number two, the ductus arteriosus, and number three, the ductus venosus. So, let's have a look at this first image. In this first image, we can see, firstly over on the left-hand side, this dotted line representing the placenta. At the very top above the fetal heart, we can see the pulmonary circulation of the fetus. Very simply, the pulmonary circulation of the fetus is referring to the circulation through the lungs, and the systemic circulation of the fetus is referring to the circulation through the body of the fetus. In the middle, we can very clearly see the heart as well. Now, the key thing that I'll turn your attention to first is both the maternal artery, the fetal vein, the maternal vein, and the fetal artery. These two run very closely next to one another, and it is thanks to this that the process of diffusion can occur between these two blood vessels, allowing for the mother to provide nutrition, respiratory help, and waste removal to the fetus. Now, as blood flows in via the fetal vein, it travels through the fetal vein into the vena cava before it enters the right atrium. Now, from here, blood has two possible options. Blood can either continue as it normally would through the right ventricle out into the pulmonary artery, but instead of being able to make it all the way up to the lungs, due to a really high pressure gradient, blood can't travel into the lungs, and only a small amount ever really does. What happens to the majority of blood instead is there is an additional pathway of blood known as the ductus arteriosus. And this ductus arteriosus is this small pathway which I've highlighted here. It allows blood directly to pass from the pulmonary artery directly into the aorta. So the blood can be distributed, or oxygenated blood can be distributed to the rest of the fetal body. If blood doesn't flow directly into the right ventricle, it can instead take another shortcut. And this shortcut is the foramen ovale. We can see between the walls of the atria, or the septal wall of the atria, there is a gap or a hole, and this gap is known as the foramen ovale. It allows oxygenated blood, which is passed through the right atria, to pass directly into the left atria, where it can then flow through and down into the left ventricle, out into the aorta, around to the rest of the body. So these two structures allow the fetus to bypass the lungs. That is their key job. Now, as we mentioned at the start of the lesson, there was the ductus arteriosus, the foramen ovale, and lastly, there was one other structure known as the foramen, or the ductus venosus. The ductus venosus is a pathway that allows the fetal vein to bypass the liver. So this structure that I'm labelling now is the liver, and normally it is supplied thanks to the hepatic portal system. In this instance, with the fetal vein here, blood, instead of passing through the liver, can take a shortcut into the vena cava. And that shortcut is this small pathway here that I'm drawing in yellow now. This is what is known as the ductus venosus. It again is another shortcut that allows for blood to bypass the liver and head directly to the heart for distribution to the fetal body. On this diagram as well, we can still see other key structures. I'll try and keep the colouring the same, green and yellow. So for the foramen ovale, we can see this hole between the atria. So we can fill this one in on our diagram now. So foramen ovale. And lastly, we can also see another key structure. I'll highlight it in yellow here. This being the ductus arteriosus, that shortcut between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Now, the key thing that we need to understand is what happens to each of these structures at birth. Now, at birth, due to the build-up of pressure in the right atria, or in the left atria, I should say, blood no longer passes through the foramen ovale and it closes. Secondly, the ductus arteriosus is no longer needed as blood can freely flow into the lungs, and as a consequence of this, the ductus arteriosus also closes and gradually fades away. The last structure, the ductus venosus, gradually again fades away as blood stops flowing through those umbilical vessels. The ductus venosus itself then constricts, closes off, and it turns into a ligament, allowing for all blood to then flow through the liver.